What if homosexuality wasn't a modern concept at all, but something lived and whispered about thousands of years ago along the Nile? In ancient Egypt, love and desire were far more complicated than the stories carved neatly into your school textbooks. Behind the grandeur of pharaohs and gods, there existed bonds between men, intimate partnerships, and passions that the official records tried to disguise. Some of these relationships were immortalized in tomb art, others hidden in myths, and a few so scandalous they shook royal households to the core. This is the side of Egypt. History rarely admits raw human and dangerously honest. Drop a comment with the exact time you're watching this. I love seeing when and where history finds you. And if you enjoy uncovering truths the world tried to erase, you're welcome to subscribe. No pressure, but the secrets we're about to uncover go far deeper. You shuffle into the rock-cut tomb at Saqqara Dust, rising at your ankles, the walls lit by the faint glow of your lantern. The figures staring back at you are not kings, not queens, but two men whose arms brush as though by accident, and whose faces lean toward each other like petals closing in a breeze. Their names repeat over and over in painted hieroglyphs, Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep, officials of the royal court, men of rank, men of wealth, and quite possibly men bound by something more than mere brotherhood. You pause, because here in this tomb, you meet what feels like the most intimate window into Egyptian same-sex affection. What draws your eye first are the gestures. You've seen tombs where husbands and wives clasp hands, their noses close, lips almost touching. That's the standard iconography of a conjugal bond, the imagery of a union meant to last into the afterlife. And here, exactly that. But instead of husband and wife, you see Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep. They're shown sharing embraces, their torsos brushing fingers entwined. The ancient artisan made sure you would notice the same visual grammar of affection, simply reassigned. You lean closer, and you can almost feel the stillness of a secret pressed into the plaster. Of course, scholars have argued over this for decades. Some shrug and say, "Oh, they were brothers." Others lean forward, whispering perhaps they were lovers. The debate is almost part of the wall painting itself now, as though every academic paper adds another brushstroke to the figures. You imagine the scribes of modern Egyptology clutching their pens like reed brushes defending their position. And you standing there are caught in the tension. Isn't it telling that a tomb built in 2400 BCE can still make modern people squirm? You notice the placement of the wives. Both men had them. Marriage was nearly mandatory for men of their station, but in the tomb, reliefs the wives are nudged aside, pushed into the margins, sometimes absent altogether. The central axis, the focus of eternal remembrance, is Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep together. Their union overshadows the socially proper pairing. You ask yourself, in a culture so obsessed with order, lineage, and the afterlife, why would anyone risk confusing future generations with unconventional imagery unless the bond truly mattered? You touch the cool wall, thinking about what intimacy meant in a world 4,000 years gone. Was their companionship whispered about at court? Or was it simply accepted, unremarkable part of the quiet spectrum of human life? Imagine the two of them at feasts, sitting close in the flicker of oil lamps, trading glances while musicians plucked at harps. Imagine them in the offices of the palace reviewing rolls of laborers or shipments of grain, their professional authority woven together with private fondness. The tomb immortalizes not scandal, but closeness. And you smile wryly at the modern tendency to demand categories. Were they gay? Were they just brothers? But ancient Egyptians didn't have the neat identity labels you rely on today. For them, life was about Ma'at balance order, continuity. If two men chose to be remembered as a pair, the tomb preserved the fact without commentary. It's you who wants a footnote, a definition. The walls just shrug and say, here they are, together. Step further in and notice the banquet scenes. Men line the tables, servants bring food, and in the center, Niankhnum and Khnumhotep are side by side. They share the embracing pose, their noses touching in the so-called kiss. Archaeologists gasp at this detail. It's not common, not casual. This is the icon reserved for conjugal pairs, husband and wife. And yet here, it is chiseled in limestone for eternity. You wonder how the artisans felt as they carved. Did they smirk thinking people will talk? Or was it no big deal, just following instructions? Maybe it was even an act of loyalty to their patrons. If these men wanted their togetherness etched forever, who were the artists to judge? You picture the steady hand of a carver, smoothing the curve of one man's cheek, bringing him almost to kiss another, then stepping back, satisfied. The debate, of course, rages beyond the tomb. Some Egyptologists insist on the brother theory, partly because the names Niankhnum and Khnumhotep share the root Khnum god of creation, suggesting kinship. Others point to the sheer weight of the imagery, the embraces, the kissing, pose, the banquets, the sidelined wives. If these were just brothers, then why the visual language of lovers? You roll your eyes gently at the academic hedging. Isn't the emotional temperature of the art enough? And then you think about how many stories have been lost. If this tomb had collapsed, if sand had swallowed it, you would never have known that two men could be depicted in such tender solidarity. How many other tombs might have whispered similar tales, but were ground down by time? The survival of Niankhnum and Khnumhotep feels like a fluke, a cosmic wink. You imagine them grinning in the afterlife, amused that their images spark debate 4 millennia later. You step back, adjusting your lantern. The chamber is quiet, but in that silence, you feel the insistence of human intimacy pressing across the centuries. Whether as lovers, as brothers, or as something you can't categorize, they chose to be remembered together. And in ancient Egypt, remembrance was everything. Tombs were not history books. They were engines of eternity. To be carved side by side meant to remain side by side forever. So here you are, in the cool dark of Saqqara, realizing that in the midst of dynasties, wars, and gods, what survives sometimes is simply two men who wanted to face eternity hand in hand. You exhale softly, a little drowsy, a little awed, and let that thought cradle you, that love, however expressed, however debated, has always looked for ways to carve itself into stone. You carry the lantern light of Saqqara with you, letting the warmth of those carved embraces drift from stone to fiber, and as the glow softens, you glide from wall reliefs to a torn papyrus, where the same hush of closeness is preserved in ink and implication. You slip quietly into the rhythm of another scene, one recorded not in limestone, but in the pale weave of reeds, its edges frayed, though its voice still steady across 3,000 years. The text is torn gaps, like small pauses, but enough remains to sketch an image. A pharaoh, walking alone at night, steps careful on the stone paths, the palace receding behind him. This is Neferkari later remembered as Pepi II, and you follow, as he moves through the stillness of Memphis, wrapped in darkness and discretion. His destination is not a temple or council chamber, but the house of a man named Sassanet, a general. The surviving line states it without ornament. His Majesty went forth at night. You hear the calm of it, as if the writer wants your attention on the act itself. No procession, no herald, just a sovereign leaving ceremony behind to knock in silence at another man's door. You picture guards keeping their eyes ahead, the faint rasp of sandals on dust, the city holding its breath. The tale pauses at the threshold. Someone sees. In stories like this, there is always an observer, and here the watcher counts hours as the king remains within Sassane's house. It is that detail, time measured and lingered over, that suggests more than inspection. Why visit secretly if what passes between two men can be handled by daylight and scribes? The papyrus does not answer. It does not need to. Stand with your imagination at Sassane's doorway. The lintel carries protective signs. An oil lamp steadies its flame against plaster. A servant wakes in a start at the sovereign's presence. Inside, air smells faintly of lotus and beer. Two voices lower into ease, free for a little while from the rigid theater of rank. The papyrus withholds scene work, but the white space between the lines holds a weight that is not administrative. What unfolds is not an accusation in the language of law. Egyptian texts rarely codify desire between men as crime. They prefer the shape of suggestion, the pressure of reputation, the way a story can bend judgment without naming it. That is what happens here. The episode endures not as decree, but as lesson. A closing line arrives, like a proverb placed on a shelf. What hides in night will be seen by day. The warning is less about an act and more about the danger of secrecy of favor, of a king's balance tipping away from Ma'at order, rightness, harmony, by stepping where the morning cannot see. Ask yourself why such a tale would be copied at all. Scribes of the House of Life preserved it not as official chronicle, but as something that resonated, perhaps a quiet satire, revealing that rulers are also men. Perhaps a moral note on vigilance. Perhaps for a few readers, simply an intriguing glimpse into the hidden center of power. However, read the story sits where intimacy and authority touch, and that is always a charged boundary. Remember what you carried from Saqqara, the visual grammar that places two men in the space reserved for conjugal union. Here the grammar is narrative, and it uses different tools. Timed visits, closed doors, dawn returns to trace a similar curve of closeness. In both cases, you see acknowledgement without label presence, without explanation. Egypt does not hand you identity terms. It hands you scenes and asks your senses to do the rest. You follow Neferkari back through cooling air just before sunrise. Cloak, damp with dew, he passes the threshold of the palace corridors, swallowing the sound of his steps. No herald announces what the night contained. Yet something has shifted, because the tale has been carried forward. Whispers take on the sturdiness of ink. Ink becomes memory. Long after campaigns fade, the image that remains is of a king who chose to walk alone to another man's house and stay there until dawn. Notice how reputation in this world is a living thing. In myth, Horus and Seth turn intimacy into a contest of rank. In tomb art, position on the wall fixes who stands with whom forever. In this papyrus, a single midnight movement becomes a test trace of character. To whisper that a king visited a general in secret is to press on more than curiosity. It is to ask whether a ruler's judgment holds under cover of night, whether the scales of Ma'at remain even when no one is expected to watch. You roll the papyrus gently in your mind, letting its frayed edges close. The house is quiet again. The city returns to its rhythm, and the palace resumes its daytime design. What persists is the awareness that Egypt could imagine such a bond, and having imagined it could use it to teach, to tease, to caution. You do not receive a verdict, you receive a scene. And as with the two men in stone, the scene is enough to keep you walking forward, eyes adjusted to half light, attentive to the ways affection can guide, disturb, and outlast power. The silence of the papyrus fades, and instead of night streets, you find yourself in the blinding light of myth, where the air quivers with gods arguing, and the Nile itself seems to lean in to listen. The stage is no longer a general's house or a tomb chamber, but the cosmic courtroom where Horus and Seth drag their quarrel over Egypt's throne. Here, intimacy does not soothe or console. It becomes a weapon sharpened to wound. The quarrel begins, like any other contest. Seth, storm and desert, insists on his right to rule, while Horus, falcon-eyed and youthful, presses his claim as son of Osiris. The tribunal of gods grows weary of their shouting. And then Seth, sly and brutal, changes tactics. He decides that to disgrace Horus is better than to out-argue him. If he can mark the falcon with humiliation, the throne will tip his way. What follows unsettles you because the myth makes no attempt to veil it. Seth attempts to overpower Horus, believing that to force intimacy upon him is to inscribe defeat onto his very body. In this divine drama, sex is not affection, but domination, a brand of dishonor. Yet Horus refuses to be written on. He intercepts Seth's seed, tosses it into the river, and plots revenge. The reversal is almost mischievous. Horus smears his own seed onto Seth's favorite food, fresh lettuce, a staple green in Egyptian diet and ritual. When the tribunal demands proof, the gods call out to see whose seed is inside whom. Seth proudly declares himself the victor, until the voice from within his own body responds, it is Horus's seed that answers. The divine assembly erupts not with outrage, but with laughter. Seth, who sought to disgrace, is himself disgraced. Linger here a moment. Lettuce, that ordinary vegetable, becomes the punchline of a cosmic trial. You can almost taste the irony. Crisp, slightly bitter leaves turned into instruments of ridicule. The myth makes you smile, but also makes you think, why tell the story this way? Because in Egypt, sexuality was not invisible. It was a language that could be bent into satire, a theater for exploring dominance, weakness, cleverness, and cosmic order. Look closely at what this story reveals. It does not treat intimacy between males as something alien or unthinkable. On the contrary, it assumes the audience knows exactly what is being described. The focus is not morality, but meaning who is in control, who is humiliated, who emerges stronger. For the Egyptians, the same gesture could be read as eternal love in a tomb scandal, in a papyrus, or comic humiliation in a myth. Context, not category, determined interpretation. Imagine the courtroom of gods, Ra presiding with a wearied eye, Thoth scribbling notes with amused precision, Hathor covering her smile with her hand. They are not scandalized. They are entertained, and they are learning who among the rivals can turn cunning into triumph. Horus, by wit and restraint, proves himself more fit to rule than Seth by force and arrogance. What lingers with you is not just the comedy, but the boldness. Later cultures would bury such stories, but Egypt put them into the mouths of its gods. Nothing was off limits if it revealed truth about power. To laugh at Seth was to affirm that the throne belonged to Horus, that Egypt's order would not be secured by brute dominance, but by cleverness and balance. You leave the divine tribunal with the sound of that laughter echoing behind you, a strange chorus that makes you aware once again of how differently the Egyptians approached the intersections of love, shame, and politics. And as the noise fades, you feel yourself stepping back into the human world, where barracks rise along dusty streets, and soldiers, too, learn to navigate closeness, rivalry, and the fragile boundaries of honor. What happens to myths of gods when you march them down into the dust of a soldier's barracks? You've just watched Horus and Seth twist intimacy into a duel for Egypt's throne, and now you step into the human echo of that cosmic stage, rows of reed beds, the smell of sweat and beer, and men learning how closeness can both protect and endanger them. Imagine a fortress on the desert's edge. The sun beats down on mud brick walls, and inside the barracks you find order without luxury. Narrow beds, lined up shoulder to shoulder, wooden chests tucked beneath them, spears stacked in disciplined bundles. Soldiers eat together, drill together, sleep within arm's reach. In such tight quarters, distance is impossible, and so the men learn to police nearness with unspoken rules. A hand steadying you after too much beer is fine. Lingering too long, not fine. Sharing a blanket when the desert cold cuts through linen, acceptable. Mocking a comrade's softness, dangerous. These rules are not carved on stone. They are enforced in glances and jokes that bite or soothe in the fragile currency of respect. Listen to their evenings. After the drills fade, songs rise around the fire. Some verses are bawdy, some tender, all of them carrying undertones the men understand without naming. A joke may frame one soldier as the Horus and another as the Seth, letting everyone laugh, while quietly reminding each man of the thin line between honor and ridicule. The myth you left behind has already seeped into campfire banter, shaping how soldiers interpret closeness. Intimacy, when spoken of, is satire more than scandal, a way to tease, to check arrogance, to remind each other that no man, not even a king, escapes vulnerability. The barracks, though, are not just rumor mills. They are survival chambers. Marches last weeks, garrisons months, campaigns even longer. Everything that sustains a soldier, bread, water, a hand on the shoulder. When exhaustion collapses, the body comes from the man beside him. Trust is life. And trust in such a world grows into bonds that can look to modern eyes like something beyond comradeship. One papyrus letter, battered and smudged, has a man address his fellow simply as my brother, though no blood tied them. That word "sain" in Egyptian could mean sibling, but it also meant chosen companion, the kind of bond you carve into eternity. Shift now to Deir el-Medina, the village of tomb builders who worked in gangs like soldiers in stone. Their lives echo the barracks' cramped houses, shared tools, months spent, cut off from families, the same need to keep humor balanced on a knife edge. Ostraca, shards of broken pottery bear their traces. One shard tallies bread rations. Another shows a sketch of two workmates drawn nose to nose, a teasing doodle that feels halfway between mockery and admiration. You can almost see the artist smirking as he tossed it aside, never knowing it would survive millennia as a wink toward affection. Jokes, letters, doodles, rules. These were the invisible threads keeping men together in long stretches of labor and war. But beneath the teasing was always a seriousness. No group could function if intimacy became humiliation, if trust soured into ridicule. That is why reputations mattered more than laws. No statute ever forbade men from being close. What mattered was whether that closeness threatened the harmony of the group. A soldier shamed could not fight well. A craftsman mocked could not carve straight lines. A comrade who lost face pulled everyone down with him. You remember Horus and Seth again, their cosmic trial ending with laughter at humiliation. The soldiers here laugh too, but they know when to stop. Teasing tests the strength of a man, but breaking him helps no one. In that way, the camp and the quarry mirror the myth, but soften its edges. For gods, intimacy was a weapon. For men, it was a lifeline threaded carefully through song, through sharing, through the unspoken comfort of being watched over in the night. Picture it now, the lamps guttering low bodies stretched on reed mats, someone murmuring half asleep, another shifting against the cold. You hear snoring, coughing, even the half-dreamed cry of a soldier calling a comrade's name. At dawn, they will rise, strap on shields or shoulder baskets of stone, and the rhythm of survival will begin again. But in the hours before morning, you feel the same truth that has followed you from tomb to papyrus to myth closeness between men. Whether whispered, joked about, or quietly lived, has always been part of Egypt's story. By now, you've walked through stone embraces, midnight rumors, divine trickery, and barracks filled with wary laughter. Yet there is another way. Intimacy survives, not as scandal or satire, but as music, as poetry that lingers on the tongue long after the singer has fallen silent. If soldiers carried closeness in jokes, and gods and courtroom lettuce lovers across the Nile carried it in verse, and you drifting along the current, hear those verses rise like birdsong at dusk. Picture a courtyard at twilight, a young scribe unrolling a fresh sheet, the ink smelling faintly of resin. His hand hovers, then moves with rhythm lines shaped like waves, meant not for the state archive, but for someone's heart. These are the love poems of ancient Egypt, and they speak in voices both playful and earnest. My heart flutters when I see you. One poem admits it leaves me unable to know my body. Another teases 7 days. Without you is like sickness. Food is tasteless beer. Flat living is impossible. You can almost hear the laughter, the shy confession, the quick glance across a room. What matters is not who the you is, but how deeply the poets were willing to describe the ache of desire. The beloved might be a woman, yes, but the words themselves are not bound by gender. Lines of longing, of devotion, of sleeplessness were carved into ostraca and papyri without needing to specify. The universal is what mattered, the heart that stumbles, the appetite that disappears, the joy of a glimpse across the reeds. For anyone who has loved the poems, speak plainly. Carved on tomb walls, you find gestures that echo the poetry. A hand reaching across a table, a shoulder leaning close, a figure drawn smaller to signal not weakness, but fondness. These are subtle cues Egyptians rarely inscribed. I love you outright, but they knew how to embed tenderness in line and color. You remember Ninkhnum and Khnumhotep, the way their noses touched their arms and folded. That wasn't an accident of artistic style. It was a visual poem written without words. Even the smallest phrases carry weight. In letters between friends, pet names slip through my brother, my beloved companion. The words could be practical, but the warmth bleeds through. Imagine receiving such a letter after weeks away, your eyes scanning the ink, your chest easing at the simple recognition. It didn't need to declare romance outright. It carried the comfort of being cherished. Now step into a banquet hall. Musicians plucking harp singers, letting verses rise above clinking cups. Love songs were often performed aloud, the audience smiling at the familiarity. And you sitting among them, notice how no one blinks at the theme. Desire is not something hidden away. It is celebrated, folded into entertainment. That doesn't mean every attachment was safe from ridicule. Egyptian humor could be sharp, but it does mean love itself was never treated as alien. Think about what this reveals. Intimacy in Egypt was not always trapped in the realm of scandal. It could be celebrated openly, even if obliquely. Poems were safe containers for feelings that daily life might not allow. You imagine a young man reciting lines to another in the quiet of a garden, or scribbling verses in the margin of his work tablet. Maybe his peers laughed. Maybe they nodded in recognition. Either way, the words remained as stubborn as the river itself. Listen closely to one fragment, "I belong to you," like the field to the farmer, like water to the fish. The metaphor feels timeless, rooted in daily life, yet lifting into devotion. There is no need to explain who belongs to whom, or whether the pairing fits a rigid category. The point is belonging, the comfort of fit, the insistence that love transforms ordinary bonds into necessity. As night deepens, you feel the poems gather around you like a chorus. They do not demand clarity. They do not offer labels. They simply say love makes the heart stumble, the tongue falter, the body ache, the world sweet. That, too, is part of Egypt's untold story, that affection was not only carved into stone or hidden in rumor, but sung aloud, enjoyed, passed around like a jug of beer. And so, as you close your eyes, the echo lingers, verses floating over water, words carried by reed pens, gestures etched in painted lines. They remind you that intimacy has many dialects, some loud, some whispered, some sung into the warm air. In Egypt, the language of affection was never erased. It was only waiting for you to listen. The love songs fade like echoes over the water, and when you open your eyes again, you are standing in the dim hush of a temple. The smell of incense coils up around you, the air cooler than the desert outside, and here intimacy takes on another face, less about longing or scandal, more about holiness and transformation. You've left behind the soldier's barracks and the poet's courtyard, and now you walk into sacred space where gender itself is stretched, blurred, or reshaped in devotion. Look first at Hapi, the god of the Nile flood. On temple walls, his body is shown with a round belly and pendulous breasts, neither entirely male nor female. He is fertility embodied abundance, personified, and his androgyny was never mocked. To Egyptians, Hapi's blended form symbolized completeness, the balance of opposites that kept the land alive. You can almost hear priests chanting as they painted him blue, the color of river water. His body, a reminder that life flows best where categories dissolve. Then your gaze shifts to Hatshepsut, the woman who wore the crown of Pharaoh. In her statues, she often appears with a false beard, broad shoulders, and the kilt of a king. Step close to the stone, and you realize this was not disguise so much as assertion. She didn't erase her femininity. She infused her reign with it, yet she also claimed the masculine imagery that Egypt associated with power. To later eyes, it seems like contradiction. To her people, it was balance, a ruler who embodied both halves of the divine order. And then there are the priests. To serve in temples often required ritual purity, bodies shaved of hair, clothing stripped to the simplest linen, voices tuned to chant. The effect as you watch is almost otherworldly. Gender presentation flattens into sacred function. The human form becomes a vessel for the god's presence. You imagine standing in a hall during festival, hundreds of bodies moving in measured rhythm, each one blurred into a collective that is neither male nor female, but holy. You realize that in Egypt, devotion could make gender pliable. What mattered was not rigid identity, but the ability to embody balance to channel divine power. A god might be painted with both breasts and muscles. A queen might wear a beard. A priest might erase personal markers altogether. In these spaces, the spectrum of gender expression was not threatening, it was essential. Think back to what you've seen Nyanknum and Khnumhotep clasping hands in stone Neferkare, walking alone in the night Horus, and Seth twisting intimacy into satire soldiers, joking in barracks, scribes writing poems that melt into song. All of those moments lived in the human world, full of risk humor, affection, or shame. But here in the temple, intimacy feels different, raised out of the human lifted toward eternity. You trace your fingers along a hymn inscribed on a wall. It speaks of gods as father and mother, he and she voices blended into a single tone. You pause, letting the cadence wash over you. It tells you that the Egyptians knew, without ever needing to lecture, that the sacred was too vast to be contained by one body, one gender, one form. To channel divinity, you had to embody paradox. You picture the great festivals, priests carrying sacred barks, god images veiled in cloth drums and sistrums rattling like heartbeat. The crowd presses close, watching figures whose gender slips fluidly depending on costume role and ritual. Some spectators whisper, some cheer, but no one questions whether the blurring is wrong. It is holy. It is the way of things. And so as incense lingers in your nose and the cool stone presses against your palm, you understand this too was part of Egypt's intimacy. Not just lovers, not just rumors, not just poetry, but the embrace of duality, the sanctifying of ambiguity, the recognition that to be close to the divine is to step beyond the neat categories of human society. When you leave the temple, the desert light feels harsher, as though the outside world insists on binaries the inner chambers did not require. But you carry with you the memory of Hapi's body, Hatshepsut's statues, the shaved priests chanting in rhythm. You carry the sense that Egypt allowed sacred spaces to be laboratories of identity places, where devotion was expressed by slipping free of ordinary boundaries. It makes you wonder if the gods themselves could be both. Why would mortals ever be only one thing? The incense thins as you step back into sunlight, and the smell that replaces it is river-sweet mud, warming papyrus bruised by wind water, lifting tiny glints to your eyes. After gods who refuse single shapes, you let the Nile teach you the same lesson by other means. Here nothing is only one thing. A bank is also a road. A reed bed is also a curtain. A silence can be privacy, or politeness, or simple exhaustion. You breathe, and the land exhales with you. Hapi's rounded form lingers in your mind as you watch the flood marks ring the walls like quiet calendars. This river is Egypt's first archive and its second destroyer. It feeds, and it forgets. A letter tucked under a jar might survive a century of dry air. A song hummed over a water jar vanishes by nightfall. What you know of desire endures mostly in stubborn materials, stone pottery paint. So the record favors officials with budgets and artisans with steady hands. Ordinary caresses dissolve into silt. You learn to read absence as part of the text. Walk the lane between mud brick houses and listen to the language of modesty. Courtyards open like palms, then close with a linen drape. A roof at dusk becomes a room no wall can claim. The neighbor's laughter is a net that catches any sound too bright. You have learned from barracks how men regulate closeness with glances. Here, entire households do the same. Affection travels as small errands, an extra jar of beer appearing at a threshold, a sprig of lotus left on a windowsill, the long pause at a doorway that is less hesitation than agreement. You remember the mythic lettuce and smile because vegetables gossip here too. A basket of figs left at dawn can say what a mouth shouldn't. Ointment cones ride hair at festivals and drip perfume that names a person without speaking. A garland tossed from a balcony is both decoration and decision. Egyptian culture is earnestly ceremonial, but it also loves the little code. You start to recognize how objects volunteer for duty as messengers. Under a sycamore by the canal, you hear the soft quarrel of lovers in a poem, the same fever you floated past on a scrap of papyrus now breathed as air. The poem never says man or woman, only you, and the you is a bowl that fits whomever drinks. The lyric rides the water, then disappears, and you accept that the archive of the river is mostly a school for your intuition. You are not gathering verdicts. You are cultivating eyes. Inside a painter's workshop, the grammar returns, hands crossing tables, chairs drawn just a little closer, then protocol demands, figures, at equal scale sharing one offering table. The painter chews his reed brush and decides that a forearm may rest across a shoulder, that noses may hover, that a wife, if she appears at all, will be gently folded to the edge of the scene. You have seen this before in Saqqara, and every time you meet the gesture again, it argues patiently for a reading that modern categories cannot swallow whole. Do not mistake the quiet for indifference. Egypt speaks loudly when it chooses. Instruction texts praise self-control. Yes, but their praise implies appetite. Satire stings precisely because everyone recognizes the target. The proverb about night and day survives because people understand what night invites. The absence of a statute does not mean absence of stakes. Honor is the neighborhood's weather. Gossip blows like wind along the alley and cools any fire that threatens Ma'at's balance. By the granary, you watch scribes tally grain hands, flying voices low. One calls another Estsin brother, and the word lands with layers you've learned to feel. It can mean sibling or partner, or the man you would trust with your rations and your sleep. Egypt does not carve identity on the face. It hides it half winking in ordinary words. Elsewhere, you overhear Mary Beloved tucked into a line about a loan of oil. It is practical, and it is not. At the river steps, women rattle sistrums, and men clap in time. A festival swells. Perfume thickens. Dancers lift their arms. The sacred boat rocks like a lullaby. You've just left a temple where gender bent toward holiness. Here in the open, the same plasticity looks like play. A boy dresses as Hathor in comic mask, and nobody faints. A woman drums with a soldier's economy, and nobody objects. It is not that rules never exist. It is that the day can hold more than one shape at once, and people know how to stand aside for it. When evening cools, the wall's rooftops bloom with mats and talk. A jar passes, laughter softens to murmur. Somewhere, a quarrel snaps once, then mends. You imagine a pair of shadows lingering at a parapet longer than weather, requires then withdrawing, before any neighbor can turn the moment into story. You think of the king, who walked at night, and the two officials who chose to face eternity together, and you realize how much of Egypt's truth lives between what is carved and what is kept private. The river has taught you a fringe of reeds can be a veil, and a veil can be a promise, and a promise can be a silence you agree to share. You leave a lane and enter another, and the smell of bread fades into the clean sting of laundry drying on ropes. The city is not hiding anything from you. It is simply insisting that you use all your senses. You touch walls warm From the day you step over a sleeping dog, you listen for the pulse beneath official noise. When desire moves here, it prefers a side path through token and timing, through gifts, and glances through the way a door opens a finger's width, wider for one person than for any other. The Nile laps against the key. A light goes out, then another. You think of the scribes, who saved jokes and hymns and proverbs, but could not save the brush of a hand in passing. You are not disappointed. You are oddly at peace. The untold in this history is not a blank. It is a texture. You learn to cradle inference like a lamp, its small circle of glow, enough to keep walking toward households where heirs and duty complicate affection, toward rooms where lineage is negotiated with tenderness, toward the quiet gears that let a society bend without breaking. The alleys fade into courtyards, and now you find yourself inside a house where the walls are plastered white cool against the heat outside. Lamps flicker. Children shuffle. Servants move with baskets. Here, intimacy is no longer whispered between soldiers or sketched on ostraca. It is shaped by inheritance, by households, by the steady machinery of kinship. Egypt breathes family, and in that breath, desire must find ways to fit. A scribe unrolls a document. On a low table, marriage contracts, property, transfers, lists of heirs. The words are precise, careful, because the house is not just a home, it is an economic engine. To pass goods from father to son, to ensure the shrine is tended to keep the line alive, marriage is expected. A man may love differently in private, but in public, he must provide heirs. Wives are written into contracts as stabilizers of the household, even when their presence on tomb walls is marginal, as you saw with Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep. So how does desire slip between these gears? Quietly in spaces where parchment does not reach. A man may marry to satisfy expectation, yet the central bond of his life may lie elsewhere with a fellow official, with a comrade, with a brother whose name carries the weight of devotion. Society does not forbid it outright. Rather, it insists that the machinery of lineage keep turning. Beyond that, silence reigns, and silence leaves room. Picture a banquet the family assembled, wives adorned. Children watched. Protocol shines like polished copper. But in a corner, two men exchange a glance, brief but insistent. Everyone sees what they wish. The wife sees her husband fulfilling duty. The neighbors see a stable household. Only the two know the glance is a lifeline enough to sustain another season of pretense. Egypt does not collapse under such dualities. It thrives on them. Balance ma'at always leaves space for contradiction, so long as order itself holds. Kinship, you realize, is flexible. Adoption exists. Stepchildren are folded into households, and titles shift with convenience. Son may mean heir, not necessarily blood. Wife may mean keeper of the shrine, not necessarily beloved. The system allows maneuvering, which in turn allows desire to hide within its folds. The legal text looks stern, but the lived reality is more porous. Move into the women's quarters, and you hear different whispers. Wives form their own networks, sometimes affectionate, sometimes competitive. They too navigate affection outside rigid roles. A wife might care deeply for a handmaiden, or find companionship among female kin. Such ties rarely survive in writing, but you glimpse them in tomb paintings, where women clasp hands or sit thigh-to-thigh, gestures of closeness rendered without comment. In a society obsessed with heirs, women found their own spaces where affection bloomed outside the shadow of lineage. Inheritance law, ironically, could protect such bonds. If a man left property to a chosen brother, no one tore the papyrus up. The bequest stood as long as the ritual formulas were followed. And so, affection could slip into permanence not through confession, but through the bureaucratic stamp of ownership. Love might not be named, but it could be endowed with land cattle servants. The archive remembers property where it forgets passion. But if you know how to read, the property points to passion. Think again of Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep. Their wives appear but faintly like margins. Their children inherit, but the tomb itself belongs to the two men together. It is a perfect example of Egypt's compromise duty, acknowledged heirs provided, but love immortalized elsewhere in stone. Society looked the other way. As long as the shrine was tended, the fields plowed, the taxes paid. As night deepens, you hear the rhythm of a household settle, the clatter of bowls wash the quiet murmur of bedtime stories, the scrape of a lock. Behind the facade of order, there are countless microcosms of affection, some public, some hidden. Each household finds its balance, its own blend of duty and desire. What the record shows is lineage. What the silence shelters is love. And you lying back beneath the plaster ceiling realize that Egypt's genius was not in erasing contradiction, but in containing it. Household heirs, quiet flexibility. They allowed society to keep turning while individuals carved their own truths into private space or into tomb walls where the eyes of eternity might bear witness. From the quiet rhythm of households, you slip outward again into the streets where neighbors trade not contracts, but glances. If inheritance and shrines keep families anchored, it is reputation that keeps them afloat. And reputation in Egypt is fragile made and unmade less by law than by the murmur of voices. You notice first, what is absent, there is no carved statute forbidding love between men, no papyrus decree outlawing affection outside the expected bonds. The courts cared about theft assault, neglect of duties, blasphemy. But a whisper, a rumor, a joke. These had no docket. They had instead the entire weight of community judgment. To live in Egypt was to live inside a net of watching eyes. Step into a marketplace at midday. The heat presses down, but gossip rises sharp and bright. A seller jests that his rival spends too much time with a certain scribe. The crowd laughs, and suddenly the rival's reputation bends. No law is broken, yet something valuable is damaged. Egyptians used humor like a blade, sometimes playful, sometimes cruel, always effective. Think back to Neferkar and Sassanet, the king and the general. Their midnight visits were never prosecuted. Instead, they became the stuff of satire copied in scribal schools. The moral wasn't a legal penalty. It was shame, the sense that a ruler had let secrecy cloud his dignity. The papyrus worked not as record, but as warning. What you do in the dark will be seen in the day. And so, reputations lived or died, not in courts, but in stories passed along half smiling, half scolding. You see the same pattern in soldiers' barracks. Jokes ripple after supper, most of them harmless, some of them biting. A man who lets himself be mocked too often risks being seen as weak. Soft, they say, and the word spreads like smoke. No officer punishes him, but his place in the group shifts. He may still march, still fight, but his laughter no longer rings with the others. To be teased is ordinary. To be marked by ridicule is ruin. Even in the village of Deir el Medina, Ostraca carries sketches that parody colleagues' cats serving mice donkeys strumming harps. Harmless on the surface. Yet each joke reminds the community who is inside and who is outside, who can take the sting and who cannot. Reputation is currency, and gossip is inflation. Festivals, too, expose you to this undercurrent. By day, the crowds dance and sing. By night, songs grow sharper. A verse might hint that a man favors another man too openly, and the laughter of hundreds cements the suggestion. No fine is levied, no priest intervenes, yet the damage is done. Egypt thrived on balance, and anything that threatened balance could be corrected by ridicule more efficiently than by law. This is the paradox you keep running into. Love could be carved into stone for eternity, yet mocked in life with cutting ease. The tomb said, "This is who I am forever." The street said, "This is who you are today." Both were true, and every Egyptian lived between them. Think again of Ma'at, the principle of order, truth, harmony. To break Ma'at was to invite chaos, and while affection between two men might not disturb the gods, losing control of one's reputation certainly did. A leader seen as undignified, a worker seen as untrustworthy, a soldier seen as weak, these imbalances could ripple outward, destabilizing the whole. Gossip was therefore not just idle chatter. It was the community's way of policing the fragile fabric of honor. As dusk falls, you walk through a neighborhood lane and hear a quarrel break out, two men shouting, one accusing the other of taking liberties, the other denying. Neighbors gather not as witnesses for law, but as chorus. Their murmurs tilt the balance. By the end of the night, one man walks away, humiliated not because of any decree, but because the crowd has chosen whom to believe. Tomorrow, when he enters the market, the silence around him will sting louder than any judgment. And so you come to understand, in Egypt, shame was the court rumor, the trial laughter, the sentence. The law remained silent, but the people were never quiet. A single word, a gesture, even a crooked smile could tilt a reputation forever. As the stars rise over the Nile, you leave the gossiping streets with a heavier sense of how fragile intimacy could be in daily life. In the tomb, you had permanence. In the household, you had compromise. But here in the open air, all you had was reputation, and that could be undone in a single verse of song. The street corner whispers dissolve into wind, and with each step forward, time stretches. Mud brick gives way to marble. Egyptian hieroglyphs yield to Greek letters, and you begin to feel how layers of conquest reshape the story. If gossip was Egypt's courtroom, now new judges arrive, foreign empires, new gods, new rules. In the Ptolemaic age, when Greek kings ruled from Alexandria, Egypt did not simply discard its old customs. Instead, the Hellenistic world mingled with Nile tradition. Greek writers, fascinated and sometimes scandalized, recorded what they thought they saw temples where gender-bending gods still received worship stories of pharaohs retold with a foreign twist. The Greeks brought their own views of eros, often more openly discussed, more philosophically argued. Yet even their chatter could not erase what Egyptians had long inscribed in stone. Niankhnum and Khnumhotep still clasped hands at Saqqara. Horus and Seth still quarreled in myth. The Nile kept both memory and flood. Then Rome arrived, and with it a colder eye. Roman law carried sharper categories, harsher judgments. What once had been handled by reputation and innuendo now risked becoming punishable offense. In frescoes, you still see tenderness. In papyri, you still hear whispers, but the tone hardens. Where Egyptians had left space for ambiguity, Rome sought clarity, hierarchy, control. And yet, the old stories never vanished. Even under Roman rule, scribes copied hymns where gods were father and mother. Priests carried barks of androgynous deities through crowded streets. Villagers still sketched playful scenes on ostraca. Beneath the weight of empire, the Nile's current of flexibility flowed quietly on. Later still came Christianity, then monasticism, and with it a new kind of silence. By the time Coptic monks filled the desert with their chants, the old gods were ghosts, and the tomb art was half buried in sand. The monks carved crosses into temple walls, overwriting Horus with Christ. They preached a sterner morality, and in their writings, intimacy between men was recast as temptation, sin battle to be fought. What Egypt had once left, unnamed the monks named and condemned. But here is the irony, even as they denounced they preserved. Monastic letters speak of brothers torn by desire confessing to abbots begging for guidance. Their struggle is the echo of what you've seen all along, that closeness between men cannot be erased, only reinterpreted. The desert fathers fought what the old myths had laughed at, what the tombs had quietly celebrated. In their rejection, they recorded the persistence. And now, centuries later, you walk among ruins with archaeologists brushing sand from reliefs, piecing papyri together under glass. Scholars debate, were Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep lovers or brothers? Was Neferkari's night visit political or personal? Were the lettuce leaves a dirty joke or a cosmic allegory? Each theory shifts like sunlight across a courtyard, illuminating one angle, casting another in shadow. But as you stand here, lantern dimming, you realize the answer may not matter as much as the endurance. Egypt never gave you one verdict. It gave you scenes, whispers, gestures, laughter, contracts, carvings that together refuse to fit into a single box. That refusal is itself the truth. The untold history of homosexuality in ancient Egypt is not a hidden law waiting to be uncovered, but a texture woven through myth, art rumor, ritual, and silence. It is gods using intimacy as weapon and satire kings, risking their reputations for nightly visits, tomb owners carving their chosen bonds into eternity, soldiers teasing one another on desert marches, poets sighing through love songs, priests embodying both male and female in the service of gods. It is a chorus of contradictions, and Egypt never felt the need to resolve them. As dawn creeps over the desert, you let the whole journey wash over you. Stone papyrus song, satire, silence, rediscovery. You have not been handed a neat narrative. You have been given fragments, and in those fragments, a freedom. The Nile taught its people that truth was not a line, but a flood, spreading, seeping, nourishing, leaving traces in unexpected places. And so as you finally drift towards sleep, you understand Egypt's story is not that homosexuality was hidden, forbidden, or exalted. It is that intimacy in all its forms was simply part of life folded into eternity with the same care as bread beer and lotus flowers. And that is why, even now, you can still find it, waiting quietly in stone, whispering through reeds, laughing in myth, lingering in the silence between words. You've wandered through tomb walls, myths and whispers that revealed the untold history of homosexuality in ancient Egypt, proof that desire was never absent, only woven into stone rumor and ritual. But here's the twist. While ordinary Egyptians carved private joys into eternity, the pharaoh, the so-called living god, often had no freedom at all. Imagine ruling a land for decades, worshipped by millions, yet every breath monitored, every embrace judged, every night scripted by politics instead of passion. Being pharaoh looked divine in carvings, but behind those golden masks was a life of suffocating pressure, paranoia, and isolation. So now, let's pull back the gilded curtain and uncover a darker truth, why it actually sucked to be an Egyptian pharaoh. Imagine waking up each morning knowing the entire kingdom believes you are not just a man, but a living god. Sounds glamorous, right? Until you realize being treated like a deity comes with crushing expectations that make any modern CEO look like they're on permanent vacation. As Pharaoh, you're not allowed to have a bad day, a headache. Too bad the sun still has to rise, the Nile still has to flood, and the gods still need convincing that Egypt is in good hands. You can't sigh and say, "Not today." If the crops fail or the river misbehaves, people assume you messed up in your sacred duties. Imagine being blamed for the weather. Suddenly, that fancy golden crown doesn't feel quite so comfortable. You see, the Egyptians didn't just want a king, they wanted a bridge between heaven and earth. You are the Horus in flesh, the divine falcon soaring above mortals. Except instead of flying, you're stuck signing decrees and performing rituals while people whisper about your godly perfection. Every sneeze, every stumble, every flaw is measured against the impossible standard of divinity. It's like living in a never-ending job interview, where the board of directors includes both your priests and the pantheon of gods. And it's not just appearances. Your role as the son of Ra means your actions supposedly keep the cosmos running smoothly. The Egyptian word ma'at, truth, balance, cosmic order, is basically stapled to your forehead. If there's rebellion on the frontier, people wonder if you neglected Mahat. If the Nile's flood is too high or too low, they assume your connection with the gods is slipping. No pressure. You're not only managing a kingdom, you're managing the universe. Try explaining to your citizens that climate cycles exist. They won't care. You are supposed to keep harmony, and if harmony is broken, it's your fault. Priests, of course, love this arrangement. They get to whisper. The gods demand another offering, and you have to comply because your image as divine ruler depends on it. Imagine a corporate office where the middle managers get to say, "The CEO should sacrifice 3 cows today just to be safe. And if you don't." Suddenly the temple's grumble rumors spread, and your aura of divinity starts to look a little dim. You're not only managing politics, you're juggling faith and fear, like a circus act without a safety net. Historical pharaohs, like Akhenaten, tried to redefine the whole divine gig. He thought he could simplify things by focusing worship on a single god A10. Bold move. But the backlash was fierce. People weren't comfortable with shaking up tradition. They wanted the old system of gods intact, and if the pharaoh didn't deliver, they doubted his divinity. Imagine being at the top and realizing your spiritual branding campaign just tanked your approval ratings. Being divine is a double-edged sword. It elevates you above mortals, but it also means every religious experiment becomes a national crisis. And then there's the personal cost. You might like art hunting or spending time with your children, but who cares what you want? Your job isn't about being a human. It's about performing perfection. You are a symbol, and symbols don't get sick days. Hatshepsut. One of the rare female pharaohs spent her reign proving she could embody divine kingship just as strongly as any man. She even commissioned statues of herself with a false beard because the role demanded that image. Imagine how exhausting it is to constantly play a part so convincingly that even your statues have to fit the costume. So yes, being treated like a god may sound divine, but really it's a trap. You live under the weight of impossible expectations, terrified of letting your people down or angering the heavens. Every move you make, every ritual you perform, every decree you issue has cosmic consequences, or so everyone believes. And in case you were hoping to escape into private life for a little peace, Forget it. Privacy is for mortals. You're divine, remember. And while you're busy pretending to be a flawless god, let's not forget the delightful mess waiting for you inside your own household. The palace, with its gilded walls and perfumed courtyards, is less a home and more a shark tank with silk curtains. You'd think family would be your support system, but as Pharaoh, family often becomes your greatest liability. Brothers, sisters, wives, and even your own children hover around like falcons, circling each one, wondering when your grip will slip from the throne. Take Thutmose III, for example. He spent much of his early life sidelined because his stepmother, Hatshepsut, refused to let go of power. Imagine the tension at those family dinners. Every smile hides calculation, every toast feels like a test, and no one dares sip the wine before making sure it hasn't been enhanced. In a royal household poison, testers are not paranoia, they're a job description. Think about it. What other workplace requires an official food sampler whose entire career is swallowing, first so you can survive dessert? The throne itself is the source of the drama. Pharaohs often married within the family to keep the bloodline pure, a strategy that created even more rivalry. A half-brother could easily become both your brother-in-law and your most dangerous competitor. Picture sitting across from someone at breakfast who shares your DNA, your spouse, and your ambition. No wonder palace intrigue makes soap operas look tame. And because the stakes are nothing less than control of Egypt, betrayals aren't whispered secrets, they're career moves. Children don't automatically mean loyalty either. Ramses II had over 100 offspring, and while that sounds impressive, it also meant dozens of possible contenders. Each son raised with whispers that maybe, just maybe, they were more deserving than their siblings. Imagine organizing a family reunion where every cousin is secretly plotting your downfall. Even Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh, dealt with this. Her own siblings schemed against her, and at one point she was exiled from Alexandria entirely by family members who thought they could do better. Family game night. More like family coup night, and the palace women, though often dismissed in later stories, played critical roles in the power games. Royal wives weren't just companions, they were political pawns. Marrying a daughter of a foreign king could seal an alliance, but it also meant introducing a new branch of scheming relatives into the palace mix. Great royal wives competed fiercely for their sons to be named heir, and behind those elegant headdresses were minds sharp as daggers. Think of them as political lobbyists, except instead of lobbying laws, they lobbied succession, and losing could mean exile or worse. The result is that your private life, the space where ordinary people seek comfort, becomes just another battlefield. Every gift might be a bribe, every conversation might hide a threat, and every smile could mask ambition. Imagine living in a house where you can never truly relax because the person handing you your morning pomegranate might also be plotting your demise. It's exhausting, and it makes you wonder which is harder, keeping enemies at bay beyond Egypt's borders or surviving your own relatives. Of course, dodging ambitious siblings and suspicious spouses is only half the grind. The other half is the endless ritual treadmill that comes with wearing the double crown. Being pharaoh isn't simply about ruling. It's about showing up every single day to remind everyone from peasants to priests that the gods are still paying attention. Your calendar is packed tighter than a modern pop star on tour, except instead of concerts, it's offerings, temple appearances, and ceremonies that start before dawn and often drag on long after your feet ache. Imagine the scene. The temple doors creak open as the first rays of sun spill across polished stone. You, draped in linen and gold, shuffle forward with incense in hand. Priests chant, musicians strike up their harps, and statues glimmer in the half-light. The moment feels grand, until you realize you're doing this same routine tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. It's like working out at the same gym every morning, except the dumbbells are divine expectations, and skipping a session means risking famine or rebellion. The Egyptians firmly believed that rituals kept the universe running. Offerings of bread, beer, and meat weren't symbolic, they were essential. If the gods didn't get their share, the entire balance of Ma'at could collapse. And guess whose face is on the line if Anubis goes hungry? Yours. This meant you couldn't delegate too much. Sure, priests carried the workload, but the performance required your presence like a celebrity endorsement campaign that never ends. Picture yourself being the world's most overbooked brand ambassador, except the brand is cosmic order. Historical pharaohs leaned heavily on these performances. Ramses III, for example, made sure to be seen at every major festival, reminding people he was not just their king, but the key to keeping the gods satisfied. These festivals could last days, even weeks, with parades, feasting, and elaborate rituals. Sounds festive until you realize you're standing in the heat wearing heavy regalia, waving at the crowds, while silently praying your sandals don't give you blisters. There's no calling in sick. Even if you have a fever, you're expected to smile and wave like the sun god himself. And the rituals weren't just for the people's benefit, they were constant reminders to you of the stakes. Each chant reinforced your role as divine caretaker. Each libation was a message: keep this up or risk cosmic collapse. It's exhausting in a way that goes beyond physical. Imagine carrying the pressure of being the star, the director, and the producer of a show that never closes. Miss a line, and the whole kingdom feels it. Even when you're not in public, the rituals follow you. Private devotions in palace chapels, blessings before meals, purification before bed. It's like living with a spiritual to-do list that never clears. Forget Netflix before sleep. Your evenings are about ensuring the gods are tucked in with their offerings. The constant repetition might lull some into comfort, but for you, it's a cage, a divine hamster wheel spinning endlessly with no exit except death. Here's the brutal hook. Even your own body doesn't belong to you. From the moment you're crowned, every breath, every bite, every step is monitored by priests, doctors, and courtiers who treat your flesh like state property. You might think ruling Egypt means ultimate freedom, but in reality you're trapped in a golden cage where even your diet is dictated by ritual and superstition. Imagine craving a juicy roasted duck only to be told the gods prefer you eat this specially blessed bread instead. Suddenly, divine kingship feels more like a restrictive health retreat you never signed up for. Egyptian medicine was advanced for its time, but let's be honest, it was also experimental in ways you'd never volunteer for. Remedies often involved honey herbs or resins, but just as often they veered into the bizarre. Crocodile dung was sometimes used in medicinal preparations, and you can bet a priest-physician might recommend it if you complained of certain ailments. Picture yourself as Pharaoh ruler of the greatest empire of the age, swallowing something that came out of a Nile crocodile because a healer swore it would restore balance. That's not luxury, that's survival with a side of indignity. Then there's the grooming. Pharaohs were expected to embody perfection, shaven, perfumed, manicured, flawless. Natural hair. Forget it. Wigs were the order of the day, and beards, when worn, were often false braided ornaments strapped to the chin. Even female rulers like Hatshepsut donned them to fit the image of kingship. Imagine waking each morning knowing you can't show your actual face or hair in public because the godly brand requires a costume. It's like being locked into the role of a method actor for life with no curtain call. Health, too, was a constant worry. The Nile Valley was fertile, but also crawling with parasites. Schistosomiasis, caught from wading in the river, was practically guaranteed, leaving many rulers with chronic pain or worse. CT scans of mummies like Ramses II reveal arthritis, clogged arteries, and dental abscesses. Your body might glitter with jewels on the outside, but inside you were suffering, just like your subjects, sometimes more. Can you imagine ruling a restless kingdom while dealing with toothaches so severe you can't chew? Being divine doesn't stop cavities. And let's not forget death rituals shaping your life while you're still alive. Priests insisted on purification baths, dietary restrictions, and careful bodily maintenance because your corpse had to be pristine for mummification. That meant daily routines of cleansing and perfuming, not just for health, but for eternal branding. Every step you took was shadowed by the reminder that your body was never yours. It was raw material for a future mummy destined to be wrapped, entombed, and displayed like a trophy to eternity. So while ordinary Egyptians could at least live their lives with a bit of freedom, you as Pharaoh were micromanaged down to your pores. Your skin, your stomach, your teeth, your hair, none of it belonged to you. It all belonged to the gods, the state, and the ever-watchful eyes of priests. You were a king on paper, but in your own skin, you were more like a permanent patient, pampered, yes, but never free. And if your body isn't really yours, then neither are your thoughts. Inside those echoing palace halls, paranoia becomes your daily breakfast. You walk through corridors lined with polished limestone, and every reflection feels like an extra pair of eyes watching you. You know the throne looks grand from the outside, but from where you sit, it's less a seat of power and more a lightning rod for betrayal. Enemies don't just hide across the desert. They whisper from behind curtains, hover in servant lines, and sit across from you at the royal feast. Spies are everywhere. Courtiers compete for favor. Priests keep their ears open, and foreign emissaries slip bribes into the wrong hands. Everyone wants to know what you plan to do next, and some want to know just soon enough to stop you. Think about it, you can't casually complain about a stomachache without wondering if a servant will repeat it to someone with ideas about accelerating succession. Your weakness isn't private, it's intelligence. In modern terms, your palace is less like a home and more like a government office bugged with microphones in every wall. Poison is the shadow that lingers at every meal. Yes, you have official tasters, but what kind of life is it when the highlight of your dinner is waiting 3 minutes to see if the other guy keels over? First banquets full of roasted goose-honeyed cakes and wine sound extravagant, but you can't take a bite without side-eyeing the cupbearer. Even the sweetest date could conceal bitter intentions. Historical records remind us of plots like the infamous harem conspiracy against Ramses III, where his own secondary wife, Tia, and her supporters tried to assassinate him. He didn't die from palace stress. He died from an actual cut to his throat. And if that's what happens to a pharaoh known as a warrior king, imagine how fragile you'd feel just trying to sip a glass of water. Trust becomes a luxury you can't afford. Advisors flatter you, but how many secretly dream of replacing you? Servants kneel but are their bows covering sly glances, Even your guards trained to protect you might one day be bribed to look the other way. Every step through the palace feels like walking across sand that could collapse into a pit at any moment. You're both the most powerful person in Egypt and the loneliest. And the paranoia bleeds into your sleep. Imagine lying in a grand chamber under a painted ceiling of stars, yet straining to hear the faintest shuffle in the dark. Is it just a servant adjusting the oil lamp? Or is it the whisper of a knife sliding free from its sheath? Even your dreams betray you, because nightmares of betrayal are simply rehearsals for what could happen tomorrow. Power doesn't let you rest. It makes your bed a battlefield. And while you're busy watching shadows in the palace, the real danger sometimes comes from the sky, or worse, from the river that snakes through Egypt, like a lifeline with a mind of its own. The desert is not forgiving, and every Egyptian knows it. The Nile is the kingdom's beating heart, but if it swells too high, fields drown. If it shrinks too low, crops shrivel. And who takes the blame? Not the gods, not the priests, not Mother Nature. No, it's you, the Pharaoh. Imagine being held responsible for a river's mood swings. It's like being accused of ruining the weather report. For Egyptians, the annual flood wasn't just water, it was life itself. The silt it left behind fed wheat, barley, and flax. When it behaved, harvests were bountiful. But if the floods failed, famine followed. And famine in Egypt wasn't quiet. Hungry bellies quickly turned into angry crowds, and angry crowds demanded answers from the man wearing the crown. Think of it like being the CEO of a company where the entire product line depends on one unpredictable supplier, and shareholders are ready to riot at the first dip in profits. History gives us chilling examples. During the reign of Djoser, the Nile reportedly failed to flood for 7 straight years. Imagine the panic fields, barren granaries, empty people desperate. Priests scrambled to interpret the god's silence, while citizens blamed their supposedly divine king for letting the cosmic order slip. You're meant to embody Ma'at, the balance of the universe, and now even the river seems to mock you. How do you explain to your people that you can't just flip a divine switch to refill the Nile droughts brought hunger, but floods could be just as deadly? If the waters rose too high, entire villages were washed away. What do people see? Then not the generosity of Hapi, the god of the Nile, but the incompetence of their pharaoh. You're caught in a trap. Too much water, or too little, either way, it's your fault. No wonder many rulers poured resources into building canals, dikes and storage facilities, giant infrastructure projects designed to make it look like you had some control. Yet deep down, you knew the truth. The Nile doesn't take orders, not even from kings. And the desert beyond the river was equally merciless. Sandstorms whipped across caravan routes, swallowing travelers whole. Drought could shrivel even well-planned irrigation systems. Locust swarms swept through fields, undoing months of labor in hours. Each disaster chipped away at your image as protector and provider. Think of how modern politicians are blamed for economic recessions. Even when global markets are to blame, now magnify that by life or death hunger. And you have the Pharaoh's dilemma. What makes it worse is the ritual response expected of you. When the Nile falters, priests demand bigger sacrifices, more elaborate ceremonies, grander prayers. You can't shrug and say, "It's El Niño." You're marched to temples, forced to beg the gods in front of crowds, while everyone stares and silently wonders whether you've lost divine favor. And if your prayers don't work, the whispers grow louder. The throne doesn't just wobble because of politics, It wobbles because the Nile refuses to listen. Here's the catch. Those colossal monuments that leave tourists in awe today were in your lifetime, the very nightmares that haunted you. The pyramids, temples, obelisks, they look eternal now. But for you, they were headaches made of limestone and sweat. Every pharaoh wanted to outshine the last to carve their name deeper into eternity. But that ambition came at a crushing cost. Imagine running a construction project so massive it makes building the Hoover Dam look like assembling IKEA furniture, except you don't just risk cost overruns. You risk revolts, starvation, and the collapse of your reign if anything goes wrong. Take the Great Pyramid of Khufu. People still marvel at it, but Khufu himself was hardly beloved. Ancient sources describe him as a tyrant who drained resources and manpower to raise his mountain of stone. Tens of thousands of workers labored for decades, carving blocks, dragging sledges, hauling ropes under the burning sun. Though they were not all slaves, as modern myth sometimes claims they were conscripted peasants whose time away from farming left families hungry. You as pharaoh had to demand this sacrifice with a straight face, insisting it was for divine glory, while knowing half your population silently cursed your name. And the logistics were brutal. Building projects demanded quarries, transport ships, armies of overseers, and endless supplies of food to feed the workforce. Slip up in one area, and the entire machine stalled. Imagine being the one who had to approve massive shipments of grain just to keep laborers from walking off the job. It's less like divine kingship and more like running a construction company that never sleeps. One weak flood season, and suddenly you can't feed your workers, cue mutinies, delays, and angry priests questioning your worthiness. Even finished monuments weren't safe. Stone-cracked walls, collapsed floods, eroded carefully carved reliefs. Every disaster reflected on you. The unfinished obelisk in Aswan, massive and flawed with a single crack, remains a frozen reminder of how even the mightiest projects could literally break apart under their own weight. Now imagine you've poured years of your reign, countless lives, and half the treasury into a grand project, only to watch it crumble before completion. Divine hardly. More like divine comedy at your expense. The stress didn't end with construction. You also had to worry about whether future rulers would respect your monuments or chisel your name off them. Hatshepsut poured her soul into her grand mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, only for Thutmose III to later deface her legacy. Ramses II covered Egypt in statues of himself, but even his colossi were subject to erosion, earthquakes, and enemy looters. Building wasn't just about glory, it was about gambling your legacy against time, weather, and politics. And let's not forget the sheer physical risk for you personally. Pharaohs often visited building sites both to inspire workers and to keep overseers honest. Picture yourself walking through clouds of dust, the air thick with hammering and shouting, while scaffolding creaks overhead. It's a construction zone, without safety helmets or regulations. One falling block, and the living god could be squashed like a beetle. Divinity, it turns out, doesn't make you immune to physics. So yes, the monuments are impressive now, but in your time, they were back-breaking projects that drained your kingdom, fueled resentment, and kept you awake at night. What we admire today as timeless wonders were for you ticking stress bombs dressed in limestone. And just when you think you might get a break from temples and tombs, war comes knocking at your door. Being pharaoh doesn't mean reclining under palm trees while servants fan you. It means strapping on armor, climbing into a chariot, and leading men into battle. Foreign wars weren't optional. They were expected. Egypt's wealth made it a tempting prize for neighbors. And if you wanted to keep your throne steady, you had to defend it constantly. Worse expansion was seen as proof of divine favor. If you weren't conquering new lands, were you really the chosen one of the gods? Imagine the stress of being judged not only on how well you ruled at home, but on how far your army could march abroad. Look at Thutmose III, often called the Napoleon of Egypt. He led 17 campaigns into Canaan and Syria, dragging Egypt into decades of near-constant warfare. Victory brought glory, yes, but also endless logistics, feeding troops, paying mercenaries, keeping supply lines open across deserts. And war was expensive. Gold and grain that could have fed your people ended up funding chariot wheels, horse fodder, and weapons. You might win land, but you also gained resentment back home when farmers realized their harvests were being hauled off to feed soldiers instead of their own families. And let's not pretend you could fight from a safe distance. Pharaohs were expected to ride into battle at the front. The inscriptions show you charging ahead with bow drawn, striking fear into enemies. Inspiring stuff on a temple wall, but in reality it was dangerous. Chariots flipped arrows rained, and one lucky spear could end your divine reign in a heartbeat. Imagine being told your body is sacred, then being shoved into the deadliest part of a battlefield where bronze blades don't care about your titles. Foreign enemies weren't the only problem. The farther you marched, the more you relied on loyalty from allies who could betray you with a single missed shipment or a sudden switch of sides. The Amarna letters, clay tablets full of correspondence, show foreign rulers begging Pharaoh Akhenaten for military aid, while others whispered about defecting to stronger kings. You couldn't sleep peacefully, even in victory. Diplomacy was just war by another name, and when you weren't invading, you were defending. The Libyans pressed in from the west, the Nubians challenged in the south, and the Hittites stormed in from the north. Ramses II fought the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest chariot battles ever recorded. He claimed victory, of course, but the reality was murkier, so murky he eventually signed what historians call the world's first known peace treaty. Think about that. The great god-king of Egypt, supposedly undefeatable, had to admit through official documents that compromise was the only way forward. For a pharaoh obsessed with eternal glory that had to sting. Meanwhile, every war left scars on your people. Sons didn't come home. Villages lost their workers, and taxes rose higher to pay for campaigns. The soldiers who survived often returned wounded or bitter, and the priests grumbled when resources were diverted away from temples. Yes, victory expanded Egypt's borders, but it also stretched your kingdom thin, both economically and emotionally. For every victory hymn carved on stone, there were countless quiet tragedies in households you'd never see. So while temple walls bragged of your unstoppable might, your actual nights were spent worrying whether tomorrow's battle would expose your weakness or end your reign altogether. Divinity may have gilded your image, but it didn't shield you from the mudblood and exhaustion of endless war. And as if wars weren't draining enough, death offered no relief. In fact, dying might have been the most stressful part of being pharaoh. Ordinary Egyptians hoped for a modest burial and a chance at the afterlife. You had to plan a send-off so extravagant it could rival a music festival in size and budget. From the moment you put on the crown, your tomb was already under construction, swallowing resources like a bottomless pit. Imagine trying to rule a kingdom while simultaneously project managing your own funeral home. The Valley of the Kings is a perfect example. Behind those sun-blasted cliffs, tunnels and chambers spiral deep into the rock, painted with dazzling images of gods and journeys through the underworld. Sounds majestic, right? But while artisans worked day and night to perfect your eternal resting place, you worried constantly. What if they didn't finish in time? What if a crack appeared in the ceiling? What if your tomb was discovered and robbed before your soul even settled into the afterlife? For a man who controlled armies, it's humbling to know your eternal peace could be ruined by a crafty thief with a shovel. And thieves were everywhere. Despite curses painted on the walls and guards stationed at entrances, grave robbing became almost an industry of its own. Even Tutankhamun, whose tomb was famously untouched until modern times, showed signs of ancient intruders who slipped in and helped themselves. If one of Egypt's least famous pharaohs had trouble keeping looters away, imagine the target painted on the tomb of someone like Ramses II, whose treasures filled entire temples. Your gold jewels and even your carefully wrapped mummy could end up desecrated before your spirit finished the 40-day journey through the underworld. Then there's the pressure of getting mummification exactly right. Priests had to remove organs, preserve the body, with natron wrap it in linen, and recite hundreds of spells. One mistake could doom your soul to wander eternally. Talk about micromanagement. Your afterlife depends on a team of embalmers not dozing off halfway through the ritual. No wonder pharaohs invested so heavily in making sure the priests were well fed, well paid, and properly terrified of messing up. And don't forget the texts carved on your tomb walls. The Book of the Dead, the Amduat, endless hymns and spells, all meant to guide you through the 12 perilous hours of night toward the sunrise of eternity. They're beautiful, but they're also chilling. Every wall screamed a warning. You will be tested, judged, and weighed. Imagine falling asleep every night knowing your heart would one day be placed on scales against the feather of Maat. Even gods on earth had to sweat over the possibility of eternal rejection. So while the world pictures pharaohs as serene figures resting under golden masks, the truth is your afterlife preparations were anything but restful. Tombs, curses, priests, robbers, all reminders that your death was just another chapter of exhausting responsibilities. Life didn't let you rest, and death demanded even more. After all, the sweat rituals, betrayals, wars, and tomb-building your legacy might still end up as a cruel joke. You spent decades carving your name into stone, only for future pharaohs or even angry priests to chisel it right back out. Imagine pouring your life into being remembered for eternity, only to be unfriended from history with a few swings of a chisel. Talk about ancient cancel culture. Look at Akhenaten. He tried to revolutionize Egypt by worshipping the sun disk Aten sidelining all the other gods. Bold, yes. Successful, no. After his death, the priests and rulers who followed him erased his name from monuments, smashed his statues, and pretended he never existed. For a man who restructured religion around himself, that's the ultimate humiliation, future generations flipping past your chapter as though you were a typo. Or take Hatshepsut. She ruled powerfully for 2 decades, commissioning grand temples and leading trade expeditions. Yet after her death, her stepson, Thutmose III, had her name carved out, her images destroyed. He didn't just want to succeed her, he wanted to erase her. Imagine ruling with brilliance and stability only to have your own flesh and blood try to erase your memory from the record. All the divine titles, all the monuments reduced to dust because one successor wanted the spotlight. Even those who weren't erased often found their eternal monuments crumbling faster than expected. Floods, earthquakes, and time itself worked against you. Statues toppled temples, cracked, and treasures vanished. Ramses II, the so-called Great, covered Egypt in colossal images of himself, but today many of his monuments lie in ruins. Even the mighty Colossus at Memphis toppled into pieces, leaving later visitors staring at a fallen giant. For a man who wanted to be remembered as the ultimate pharaoh lying face down in the dirt was probably not the plan. And legacy didn't just depend on stone. It depended on scribes, historians, and storytellers, people who might not have liked you very much. Ancient writers sometimes painted certain pharaohs as tyrants or weaklings, regardless of what they'd actually done. Imagine dedicating your reign to holding Egypt together only for some bitter scribe centuries later to jot down that you were lazy or cruel. Once it's written, that's the version history tends to believe. The cruelest twist. For all your effort to be remembered forever, many pharaohs' names are completely forgotten today. The average person can name Cleopatra, maybe Tutankhamun, perhaps Ramses. But dozens of rulers have vanished into obscurity. Their tombs looted, their statues crumbled, their legacies overwritten. They once walked as gods on earth, and now they're footnotes if they're remembered at all. So in the end, being pharaoh wasn't the endless glory we imagine. It was pressure, paranoia, exhaustion, and the looming fear that even eternity might betray you. What remains today are ruins fragments, and the uneasy truth, the crown that sparkled under the desert sun, often weighed heavier than any mortal could bear. So as you drift into sleep, let the story settle. Being a pharaoh may have looked like gold and glory, but it was mostly weight fear and endless responsibility. You carried the Nile's moods, your family's betrayal, the gods' demands, and the heavy stones of monuments meant to last forever. And still, time washed most names away, like sand in the desert wind. Perhaps that's the quiet lesson tonight, that power rarely brings peace, and even the greatest crowns cannot outlast the hush of sleep. So close your eyes, let the desert night stretch wide around you, and breathe easy, knowing you don't have to build pyramids or hold up the heavens. Rest now lighter than a feather,